Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Jams and Tea Podcast Record Club, where each week one of us pick an album for the others to listen to, and then we talk about it. This week, serving up a nice little double feature for you, because we're talking about my recommended records. First on the list, we're going to be talking about Tom Waits' Mule Variations. You will know that in the past, I have done a worst to best on Tom Waits. Go check that out, even though it's hideously outdated. And we have covered Bone Machine on here. At the end of our first year as a podcast, we were all overwhelmingly in love with that album. And naturally, I like talking about Tom Waits, so I figured I'd do it again. But that's not the only thing on the list today, is that I paired this with another album. An album that I listened to a couple months ago and immediately got the idea for this record club. And that is Anywhere I Lay My Head by Scarlett Johansson, which, if you don't know, is a covers album of Tom Waits songs by everyone's favorite Avenger, Scarlett Johansson.
The Scarlett Johansson, indeed.
Featuring David Bowie many times. And I will say, I'll put that aside for when we're done with Mule Variations, because the reason for including that, I was a bit mysterious with, and it's not going to take up the most substantive parts of this review. So let's talk a bit about Mule Variations. Now, this album comes in a particular streak of records that is, by most Tom Waits fans, considered to be his sort of imperial era of the sort of mid to late 80s and the early to late 90s. Dude had a good couple of decades. And basically it kicked off after he sort of left after Frank's Wild Years in 1987, did a film score in between, but didn't come back until Bone Machine in 1992, 6 years later, which was his longest gap between records since he started making music. And in this particular era, in the 90s, this is when Tom takes the weirder parts of his sound that he got on Swordfish Trombones and Rain Dogs and really plays that up and just absolutely goes hard on the kind of blues, punk, experimental rock, just like making his sound as weird and as textural as humanly possible, playing up the theatricality of his sort of acting abilities as he sort of embodies a character or a world on these songs as much as the actual sounds do. And you have a run of records that's genuinely outstanding. And this is after 1993's The Black Rider, which is sort of considered the universal lowest point of this run. I don't agree.
Also more of a kind of like soundtrack sort of side project thing than
a companion to a play he wrote with William S. Burroughs. And now we have Mule Variations, which is sort of the proper follow-up. It took him a couple of years, though.
It took 6 years after Black Rider, yeah.
So there was a decent amount of time in between these two. And basically, I think one of the things that I regret not mentioning on Bone Machine is Tom's collaborators. Now, there is an arsenal of people who help him work on these records because they're very instrumentally varied. But I want to mention two presences in particular that I think are very important to understanding the oeuvre of Tom Waits. And that being, I can't believe I forgot to include this, but longtime collaborator of Tom Waits, the Primus bassist, Les Claypool, which I think is, once you find that out, it is impossible to not hear his presence on basically every single time they ever work together. And I think it's at its strongest here. And of course, the probably most influential collaborator of Tom's, which is his wife, Kathleen Brennan, longtime creative partner of his, who I think is instrumental in a lot of these records and their identity. That, as I think Tom has as much of a sort of say in conceptually as in these albums as Kathleen does, and she helped him, helped write songs, all kinds of stuff. So this is very much a group affair, but Tom is very much front and center. And the reason I wanted to discuss Mule Variations, because curiously enough, the covers album we're going to talk about later does not have a song from Mule Variations on it, which kind of helps it. But this album has, at least for me, come to grow on me and become my favorite Tom Waits album. And because it's not exactly what I would call the most immediate, and that's why it was, while I still always considered it to be sort of upper rung for Waits, which are albums that are always shifting in terms of my order. But I would say that these days, firmly, my first and second place are Mule Variations and Bone Machine. But Mule Variations specifically became an album that was really important to me, just because it was an album I went back to as a source of like weird comfort, just because this album is not aesthetically comforting in any way. But it contains, like, there's 70 minutes worth of material on here. So it just becomes a really easy record to become immersed inside of, and it contains so many great classic songs that it just felt like the logical next step to go to when discussing it as a podcast in terms of the Tom Waits canon. And it's an also interesting turn in his sound, in that it's a sort of abandons the skeletal ricketiness of Bone Machine and embraces something a little bit more atmospheric and something that's a little bit less immediate, but I think proves to be sort of more rewarding in the long run. And yeah, I know that this has been an album that Ryley's really liked in the past. At one point it was your favorite, but it was superseded by Bone Machine. But Morgan, I knew, wasn't familiar with this. So I figured this would be a good sort of amalgamate of perspectives to bring to the table in terms of our assessment of this record. And I know for a fact that all three of us more or less love the album, and we could just fucking gush about it just because there's so much to gush about.
Yeah, so let's talk collaborators real quick, because you started this off and I want to dive down and deeper as well, because you're right. We've talked so much about Waits in the Bone Machine video as a sort of singular presence, but he also has an incredible talent for surrounding himself with very talented and unique and idiosyncratic collaborators who are attuned to his particular style, understand exactly what it is that Waits is doing and what his whole thing is, and help him to accentuate all of his own quirks and idiosyncrasies while adding and filling out flavor as well. So a number of regular collaborators who reappear here, one of which is the drummer Andrew Borger, who is, I think, a huge part of what we think of when we think of Waits' incredibly eclectic and bizarro percussion, because Borger is known for using like non-traditional instruments to create very, very unusual percussive sounds. A longtime collaborator of Tom Waits. I'll also shout out Ralph Carney, who plays trumpet, saxophone, and clarinet and reeds on this record. He is the uncle of Black Keys founder Patrick Carney, and also the co-composer of the BoJack Horseman theme, for people who have that connection in mind. But is also recorded with a number of other bands, including the solo material of Les Claypool and Elvis Costello and a lot of other artists as well. So a really, really eclectic figure who adds a big presence to this record. Claypool is playing bass on Big in Japan, but there's also other bassists on this record as well, primarily Greg Cohen, who I want to shout out because he was a member of John Zorn's quartet for a while. We talked about John Zorn briefly in our main episode this week, and he's worked with a number of artists, including he plays bass on a record club we did very recently, Fiona Apple's When the Pawn, which also came out the same year as this album. So you have these eclectic collaborators that he's so good at surrounding himself with. Mark Ribot is on this record as well, who is another great guitarist who's known for his work with free jazz and no wave bands. He's worked with Zorn as well. He's a regular Waits collaborator. So many names that I have acquainted myself with by exploring through the credits here. The primary contributor to the rhythm section here, a person who plays bass on I think 7 different songs, is Larry Taylor, who was a big fixture of the original prog art rock scene of the late 60s. He was in the band Canned Heat, and he also was in Frank Zappa's bands and Captain Beefheart's bands, and has worked with so many different like fundamental artists of the really kind of wacko stuff that was happening in the 60s and 70s. And it's also worth mentioning as well, like this is probably the last of the big sort of canonical, culturally well-known Waits records. Certainly not his last great album, but I think the last record that really captivated the public consciousness by and large. I mean, this was a record that won a Grammy for Best Contemporary Folk Album. And also the track Hold On was nominated for the Best Male Rock Performance Grammy as well. So this is a big record. It was released on the Anti label as well, which is primarily a punk and metal label, but has sort of expanded throughout the years. In fact, I believe that he signed to Anti the year that they were founded in 1999. So this marks a very, I think, distinct step forward for Tom. It is less ramshackle. It is less, I guess, scattershot and just kind of whiplash inducing than records like Bone Machine and Rain Dogs and The Black Rider, for instance. But it's no less captivating. It is a record where I think, as you said, Jake, he kind of refines and hones his focus a little bit more. There are absolutely some real bizarro moments on here, some things that stand out for just being like super, super, eclectic and strange and eerie. Of course, we've had the oft memed and talked about What's He Building, and you have songs like Get Behind the Mule as well, Low Side of the Road, a song that I'm particularly fond of that's particularly weird and lodged in the back half of this record, Filipino Box, Spring Hog. You have really weirdo songs like that, Eyeball Kid, you name it. And you also have, I think, what generally tends to dominate most of the record, big in Japan as well, I forgot to mention, that's fucking, that's right off the Bone Machine type of shit. But I think what dominates the memory of most people who listen to this record is the tenderness of it, the real sense with which he is taking some of his most heartfelt and enduring sort of tendencies as a balladeer and kind of refining them even further than he has before. Almost to the point where it's like almost Tom Waits is kind of doing some balladeer sort of type songs on here that is so similar to things he's done in before, but yet he seems to be able to continually write and reinvent that style of song, which I think he calls a baller. Like if you think about his Brawlers, Ballers, and the other thing, I can't remember, a compilation where he kind of unifies Bastards, that's right, all his different kinds of styles. You have a lot of ballers on this album, so to speak. Baller. Also, why they stick in the memory so much is that I think they are by and large the greatest songs here. Tracks like Hold On, tracks like Cold Water, tracks like Georgia Lee, and of course the incredible closing duo of Take It With Me and Come On Up to the House. These are songs that you hear for the first time and you feel like they're songs that must have been written thousands of years ago. They feel instantly classic. They feel like they have existed in some form forever. And all that's happened is that Tom Waits has kind of tapped into the energy of them and actually realized them in musical form for the first time. And he's great at doing that. And that's so much of the appeal of Tom. And what I think this record is it's definitely on the longer side with regard to Tom records, and it would probably be a little bit stronger if some of the weaker moments were trimmed. Still, by and large, I think it exercises Tom's strengths in a form that is as powerful as they've ever been before, that he would kind of go into focus in more. Like the two different sort of broad styles of this album are styles that he would kind of like separate and then interrogate separately on the Alice and Blood Money duo of albums that came directly after this. So this is kind of like a fusion of those styles. It's to the testament of this album that it all comes across as well as it does, and that all of these songs work as well as they do. So much to love about this record, and songs that I will undeniably take with me to the grave.
I think the best sort of launching off point here is to talk about the start of the record, which begins with Big in Japan, which I think is maybe one of the most incredibly disarming experiences I've ever had with an opening track. I remember when I first put this on, and the first noise you are greeted to is the incredibly like fucking Tom Waits got bars beatboxing of him going bow 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 bow, and then you just
Tom
hear
Waits is like
that,
scatting at the start of the song.
yeah, and then it breaks in with that big ass drum and that sick fucking bass. Like, holy fucking shit. You can certainly tell that the guy who was in Primus is playing the bass on here. And it's got one of the most insatiable grooves I've ever heard. And it's such a bizarre song, but like all of the bizarre and weird tracks on here, it doesn't like treat that as an excuse to be insubstantial. It manages to flesh itself out and well realize it to the point where it is like at its most developed and interesting, and still manages to contribute to the album. One thing I want to mention before we keep going, because I know I'm going to remember it, is that Ryley mentioned one of the later tracks, Filipino Box Spring Hog, which is one of the weirder songs out here. And I just need you all to know how hard it makes me laugh when he goes, turkey neck stew. Endless amounts of joy. And I kind of get that from Big in Japan too. So I want to ask Morgan, as somebody who had not heard Mule Variations up until this point, what exactly did this do to you?
It was something that I like expected, but there's also not really any way to prepare for it, particularly his vocal delivery on here, which is like, I got the stuff. I got the grace. And it's like, okay.
I got the wheel, but not the truck. I love the voice. Like, I got the moon. I got the cheese.
I got the rooster. I got the crow. So point is, it's like I had to take a beat, regroup, and then like I sort of made a connection between this and a specific song from a band who has always taken more from Tom Waits than I really sort of cognizantly realized before, as it reminds me of Smooth Sailing off of the Queens of the Stone Age album.
God,
Like Clockwork.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which, funnily enough, has a music video of Josh Homme wandering around drinking with Japanese businessmen.
Yeah, a great video. I love that video.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, that's a highlight off of one of the greatest albums of all time. So once I sort of settled into that groove, I was like, oh.
And
it's like
okay.
every song on this record is either that or like the closer on like Clockwork.
Yeah.
When the fucking horns come in on this, it's like I lose, like it slaps so fucking hard. Like there's so many of these songs that are just so underrated for how much they want you to just shake your ass, man. And this is one of them.
Yeah.
I love it. And then immediately right after that, you get the stark contrast of Low Side of the Road, which to me sounds like
Mississippi Delta blues. Like it would not be out of place on Oh Brother Where Art Thou.
Black elevator.
Like it literally does sound like you are slowly going down to hell in a rickety ass like steampunk elevator, and is like the fucking like bleeding that's in the background of like that's like filtered through a layer of static. You're just kind of like, what in the god, what the fuck is this? Yeah, it's like, it's so fucking like weird. And it's like, I really like it as a sort of like way to sort of usher you into the experience of this album, because it's like, there is a distinctly sort of like hellish nature that this album sort of has in a lot of its like tonal moments, is that I think that that shares that in common with Bone Machines, that both are like very apocalyptic feeling albums. And whereas I think the apocalyptic nature of Bone Machine is like very much exploring how the world sort of degrades. Whereas I think this album is really just more about the degradation of people. Because when you sort of look for commonalities and theme of what this album is that it's basically an assembly of songs of people who are displaced or like where they shouldn't be, or who are missing something or longing for something. They have an emptiness inside them. And that's sort of the unifying kind of theme of the record.
Yeah, I mean, I particularly admire how there's an emphasis on variations in, the title, because the first three songs are so like they definitely feel of a whole, but it's also like you get to hold on after these first two tracks, and it's like this really lovely Americana ballad, and you're like, okay. I mean, it's just like a refusal to let you actually get comfortable for more than 4 minutes.
That's one of the things that I love the most about Tom Waits records. And it's why I like this record more than I like either Alice or Blood Money, which are great albums. But like the thing I love about the best thing that unifies the best Tom Waits records is that you get both sort of extremes of his sound kind of synthesized and kind of pushed against each other. And you get this sense of whiplash on all of his best albums, I think. Rain Dogs, Bone Machine, Absolutely True, Swordfish Trombones, Real Gone. Like you never are sitting within one particular mode for too long. And that's, I think, what is a key part of the Tom Waits experience is the going from songs like Hold On to songs like fucking Get Behind the Mule, which I love. I love this song. Like this is kind of emblematic of this record, right? Because this song does not need to be 7 minutes long, but I don't fucking care at all. I will happily.
If it was, it would be a worse album if it was shorter.
Like,
I am
this
adamant
song,
that is the case.
This song like evokes like being like a Chinese peasant working on a farm in the 5th century or something. Like you feel like you're living in like the Middle Ages, and you're just like kind of, reaping the fields or whatever and doing, the work, and you're gonna, go home and eat a potato, and that's your meal for the day, and you're gonna live to be 106 years old, and then this is gonna be your work song. This is
this is, to me, is a song that I think is deeply inspired by slave spirituals. Like just the sense of like forward momentum it has to be like it is a song that is crafted with the explicit intent of having other people sing it while performing a repetitious action, which, by the way, makes this a great song to listen to while doing manual labor. I would know, I've done it a lot. And I love that it follows like, and Hold On and that sort of have this great juxtaposition where it's like this song that's like bizarrely kind of inspiring, at least for songs on this record. And then you have that, which is a song that sort of like pushes you forward with like work and kind of makes you feel like tired just because of its length. So like, I understand why people might think it's too long, but that said, every single moment on here, I feel like lasts about as long as it need to, just to stretch you as thin as it wants you to. Like the 70-minute runtime at first was definitely the thing that held this back from being my favorite Tom Waits album. And now it is the reason that it is my favorite Tom Waits album. I mean, and then you go from Get Behind the Mule, and then you go to House Where Nobody Lives, which is like one of the most straightforward songs on there. And it emphasizes another great thing about Tom, which is just the art of performance and the art of like embodying a character. All of these songs are so cinematic, not in just how they sound and what instruments they use and like what atmospherics they evoke, but what Tom is embodying. Like the House Where Nobody Lives is just, you feel like you've stumbled into a bar and there's just this drunken guy singing about this fucking place that everyone's forgotten.
It's Nick Cave and fucking assassination of Jesse James.
The one thing I kept coming back to is that a lot of the like sadder, like the ballers, the ballads on here is just like this Nick Cave's The Boatman's Call, Handshake, they sound so similar at points. And that's a very good thing. They're both perfect albums. I mean, I actually think that you could draw a lot of connective DNA with why this is my favorite Tom Waits album and why Henry's Dream is one of my favorite Nick Cave albums, is that I think both hold a same similar appeal. And while Nick's vision is more concise, Tom's here is a bit more sprawling, and I just think I latch onto that more. And House Where Nobody Lives is one of the most like heart on sleeve performances, and you almost pity the man singing it, because it's like it feels like like the fact that someone wrote a song about this is the saddest part of the song. You just sort of get this sense of what these characters and what Tom values and like just the human experience. I think that like having House Where Nobody Lives on an album where the closer is Come On Up to the House is like an inspired choice, just because everything really does feel like it connects to another point on the record, because you could feel like conceivably they could be the same house that they're talking about, but they're utilized for two completely different reasons and two completely different tones.
Jake, do you know what this song reminded me of while listening to it? Completely random reference point, but just the whole idea of the house where nobody lives, the kind of like forgotten building or the forgotten place that, you know, represents so much about loss and about, you know, the inevitability of aging and all that sort of thing. And
Talk about a lot of dispute.
Yes, it reminded me of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church Blues off of Wildlife.
Yeah.
The song which is about I love that you just read that my mind exactly where I was going with that. Because I had the same thought listening to it. I was like
my favorite song on that album.
Yeah, it's the same idea, and it's so gut-wrenching and so powerful and potent. A song that hits me in a similar way as well, even though it's kind of more, I suppose, personal and less and more about kind of a relationship, I suppose, is Picture in a Frame, which is like a classic sort of Tom Waits song where it's like it has this really simple structure that's super, super inspired by, like, you know, classic blues songs. He cited Blind Lemon Jefferson and Lead Belly as influences on this track in particular. And obviously it's a song about his relationship with Kathleen. And I love the simplicity of it, but also just so much of it is Tom has this ability to take the simplest sentiment, like I love you and I always will ever since I put you a picture in a frame, and make it feel like three-dimensional purely through the tone of his voice and the way that he sings it. I love,
like, he's the only person who ever wrote that phrase.
Yeah, exactly. One of my favorite lyrics on this record is "I'm gonna love you till the wheels come off," and I think that is a perfect Tom Waits lyric because it marries these two aspects of the way he writes, this kind of like intimate, revealing your heart kind of like emotionality, and like this, you know, image of this rickety, you know, like a piece of machinery, essentially this like wagon or something, right? Like this thing that has, you know, wheels, and that at any moment they might just completely kind of fall apart and stuff. Like he marries with this line, like you get the sense of so much about who Tom Waits is as a songwriter, because you get that intimate, real, emotional expression, and you get that expressed through the notion or using the image of something that is old and haggard and functional and very much like utilitarian in a way. Like he's a very utilitarian songwriter, and that just is the Tom Waits thing in a simple little couplet. And yeah, he's so great at being able to dig into those aspects of the way he writes and really bring them up in a powerful and affecting way throughout this record. Like the way he uses repetition and simple refrains on a song like Cold Water as well, or a song like Pony too, which is a very moving song, despite being very kind of simplistic and straightforward. It blends this sort of like simple refrain thing he does with the like Dylan-esque like loaded verses that are just like kind of whirling you from one reference point to another, very much like that song off of Bone Machine about like the murder in the town. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, Murder in the Red Barn.
Murder in the Red Barn, exactly, where you have this simplistic image and motif that's contrasted in the verses with all these details about places and people, and these just images like, I run my race with burnt-faced Jake. I wish I was home in Evelyn's kitchen with old Jip curl around my feet. I work for nothing in a Belzoni sawmill. I caught a blind out on the B&O. Tallulah's friendly Belzoni ain't so. 44 will get you 99. so much like impressionistic lyricism that is so like specific to a certain thing, and then juxtaposed with just, I hope my pony knows the way back home. You know, I hope I'm not really all alone in this, essentially. Like, I hope that I'll be able to figure it out.
That's the art of what I think he does best, and what I love the most about him is that he anchors you with really relatable, simple human ideas that you can relate to, and then paints these impressionistic portraits that feel limitless. It's what makes re-listening to Tom Waits albums better than hearing them for the first time, because you can come back and like, you listen to a song like, well, basically that's another reason why this is my favorite, is that I think his songwriting is just at its apex in the 90s, and right here it's just the cream of the fucking crop right here, and you get anchored to these ideas, and you get these portraits that are just infinitely fascinating, that are like fun to interrogate from a storytelling perspective. And like, you know, you get stuff like we've talked about What's He Building in there a lot, which is like this story of just this person watching this other person with like just this infectious paranoia. This song but like musically, it sounds like you're listening to a house fall apart while he's describing this happening.
I love Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse.
I mean, that's the exact kind of shit that he's evoking. And I love that he's got lines in here that just stick with me, like, it's got enough formaldehyde to choke a horse, and there's poison under the sink, of course. And his delivery with all of these, it's like every single song, he sounds like a completely different human being.
But my favorite part of it is just the second line where he's like, what the hell is he building in there?
It's so genuine, like
it's
like actually asking.
Yeah.
No, like, because like it's like he's watching someone across the street.
Yeah.
Like, you ever just people watch like that?
Well,
where you just this isn't any of my business. But like, just watching this motherfucker do like, no, like, hang on, what the fuck is he doing?
Like you're Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window.
Well, yeah. The genius of this song, and I think that genuinely it is one of the best Tom Waits songs. I don't say that lightly, despite the fact that it's barely even musical. But the genius of it is that it is, as you say, Jack, it's an incredible assessment of paranoia, but also like it's a song about the way in which invading someone's privacy is normalized in terms of the public's feeling that they have a right to knowledge about someone that they don't know or that isn't themselves, right? This idea of entitlement that people feel to knowledge that may or may not be theirs to have, the idea of, and also how when that knowledge is not available, that people catastrophize and that they kind of come up with these ideas about, you know, what the reality is, and they invent these kind of fictions. I just yesterday I played the narrative video game Firewatch, which is very much about this idea of like, when you don't have knowledge about something, you start to make assumptions and then act based on those assumptions, and it leads you down this pathway where you get further and further from the truth while feeling like you're getting closer and closer to it. And this is a song that really just gets that idea so well and so perfectly. Like it is, and it's the way that it kind of, again, it evokes this idea of like, you know, the townsfolk kind of whispering amongst each other and kind of like spreading rumors, and the way in which information transmits, and the way in which like completely unrelated pieces of information about that one person's observed one thing, another person's observed a completely unrelated thing, and all of a sudden they're like smashed together as having some kind of connection. Now, what's that sound from underneath the door?
He lived in a place called Mayor's Income, Tennessee.
What's that sound from underneath the door? He's pounding nails into a hardwood floor. I swear to God, I heard someone moaning low, and I keep seeing the blue light of a TV show. Like, yeah, there's so much just
I love that
dissociated images and ideas here, and you can tell that they're all sort of being kind of embellished and viewed through this lens of like looking to confirm some horrible reality. that we don't get any confirmation of. And of course, it's very on the nose to end the song with the "We have a right to know" line, but that does kind of drive it home really powerfully. But yeah, it's just a fucking fantastic piece of writing. It's so just deeply unsettling and fundamentally fantastic, and just everything about Tom's fascination with sort of sociological aspects of how people work. Like, he views people and often talks about them in ways that are, you know, makes a lot of like animal metaphors essentially. And like, he views humanity very much as an animal species, and he kind of draws metaphors with rats and chickens and all sorts of like things that he sees human behavior through the lens of how these other creatures behave. And that, I think, opens you up to a very unique and insightful and maybe even slightly uncompromising view of humanity that is very much Tom's own. And that is one of the cool aspects of really kind of getting into a Tom Waits record, is you get to see the world through this very distinct lens that may be quite different from your own. And he is so good at fully embodying you within that. And often in ways that are subversive, where he's like getting you to take a certain perspective that maybe he doesn't necessarily take, but allows you to see how he's critical about something like, you know, the way that, you know, mob mentality works or whatever. Like, he's just really, really sensational at doing that sort of thing.
And after what's he building in there, you have Black Market Baby and Eyeball Kid. And I just want to say how much I fucking love these songs. Black Market Baby is one of the most instrumentally dense, laden with detail. It's a really like dirgy song, but also it's got this insatiably catchy fucking hook. The "She's my black market baby, she's my baby, my black market baby, she's a diamond that wants to stay cold." Like, it feels like it has that classic songwriting quality that makes you feel like it's like from like a Disney movie or something that you would hear like people like singing while they work or some shit. And it just, again, paints a beautiful little portrait. Like, it opens with like a, you know, man who carries a lantern and in it's his soul. And you're just like, wait, what the fuck? And like, again, everything about this track is impressionistic and awesome. And I love the kind of squonky sounds that the horns make here. Just a song laden with detail upon detail. And then you have Eyeball Kid, which is fucking like, what? My favorite moment on this is certainly the "he's just a little bitty thing, he's just a little guy," which never fails to crack me the fuck up. But
he's just a little guy.
First of all, you'll know that the Eyeball Kid is actually referenced on Bone Machine. There's a lyrical passage that does allude to him. So there's like a Tom Waits cinematic universe going on here. But it's like, what my favorite thing about this is that this whole song is about the Eyeball Kid. And he never directly describes what this kid's deal is. And so that impressionistic lyricism that he keeps weaving, you just kind of have to build what he looks like in your head, because he's like a carny sideshow attraction that people like look at. And like, what I like too is that there's like contradictory lyricism in this song, where he's just like, how does he think and how does he blink, and like how he like says things and whatever. And then there's another part of the song that says that like he can't speak. So you're just like deciding and latching on to all these different little itty bitty details. And the whole way through, it remains this really dark, really disturbing portrait of the way we kind of almost deify and like other people who have like, you know, deformities and stuff like that. The interest in people who are, you know, not seen within the traditional confines of being like attractive or even particularly normal. And you just kind of feel alienated and weird because of it. You're just kind of like, this is the kind of shit that actually used to happen. Still happens. Fuck me. And he's just screaming the whole time. He just
I think on a more somber note, we need to talk about one of the most sort of moving songs on this record that we haven't talked about yet. One of the most sort of eternal and powerful. that being Georgia Lee, which is based on a true story of a young Black girl, teenage girl who was murdered, Georgia Lee Moses. And it is essentially Tom's sort of response to that horrible event and the kind of outpour of feelings that happened in the wake of it. And I mean, the way he describes this is just like he's inherently just poetic without even trying to be. And I'll just read what he said. The girl's name was Georgia Lee Moses. It's been over a year. They had a funeral for her. A lot of people came and spoke. I guess everybody was wondering, where were the police? Where was the deacon? Where were the social workers? And where was I and where were you? Now that she's gone, one thing that's come out of it is that her neighbor has opened her home as a place where teenage girls can come, where latchkey kids can come and hang out after school till their parents get home. A lot of kids are raising their parents. You usually run away because you want someone to come and get you, but the water is full of sharks. What I love about that description of the song is that he doesn't need to talk at all about what happened to Georgia Lee. And the song doesn't really even do that at all, because in a certain way to do that would be wrong and would kind of pervert and corrupt the point of the song, which is not to, depict or linger in the ugly violence, but to talk about the feeling of tragedy and the feeling of helplessness that comes in the wake of this, and in the wake of the knowledge that these kinds of things are, eternal and can never really be stopped. There will always be, there will always be a child in a home that they shouldn't be in, that they will not escape, and there'll always be a Georgia Lee, and that whole notion is so utterly confounding and just completely horrific to Tom that all he can do is kind of like opine about God and the absence of any kind of divine intervention in such a
that's one of the
thing.
best song refrains of all time to me, is the why wasn't God watching, why wasn't God listening. It's just like, that is the most potently sad, succinct statement you could ever say about something like this.
The song gets, like, as it goes on, it progressively gets both more and more poetic in terms of like going away from just the specifics of any kind of scene and into more sort of flowery language, and also more and more heartbreaking. Close your eyes and count to 10. I'll go and hide, but then be sure to find me. I want you to find me. And we'll play all over, we'll play all over, we'll play all over again. There's a toad in the witchgrass. There's a crow in the corn. Wildflowers on a cross by the road. And somewhere a baby is crying for her mum as the hills turn from green back to gold. Like, the way he just kind of like, his lyricism almost just disintegrates into this environmental imagery, this cornfields, this rolling hills, this toads and stuff, like almost as a coping mechanism, almost as a reflection of the fact that humanity don't have a way of comprehending or understanding or even depicting the horror. And it's just a kind of a series of images. I mean, God, it's a fucking just devastating song. And it is, buried on the back of this record in a way that, it would be almost easy to not even realize it exists unless you're like really attentively listening to this record. But it sticks out and it just absolutely grabs your heart and tears it to shreds. I mean,
I shit hurted.
This album has some structural choices that I think are very disarming, especially considering its length. But in retrospect, I think reward the re-listening experience that I talk about being so essential with Tom Waits albums. And relatively less overbearingly soul-crushing songs. You have Chocolate Jesus, which I think is an eternal folk banger of a song that I love because it paints the portrait of someone who's sort of commodified and convinced themselves into their own form of religious practice. And that microcosm ends up being sort of Tom commenting on the idea of religion itself and the sort of futility and kind of needlessness of like rituals and what have you. You have the guy, got to have my chocolate Jesus, don't need no almond joy. Like, love his performance on here, fantastic. And immediately after that, you get the blitzkrieg of what that Filipino box spring hog is, which I think is, first of all, a flat fucking banger of talking about grilling up a Filipino box spring hog. I don't even know if that's a real fucking hog. It might not be, but putting Georgia Lee between those two is kind of allows you a moment, especially considering that Filipino box spring hog comes before. I've thought a lot about this. A lot. This is my favorite 1-2 punch of songs in the history of music. Wow. You have Take It With Me and Come On Up to the House, which, if I can even double down on that, again, I go back and forth with this all the time as to what I think Tom Waits' best song is. He has at least 2 candidates on every album for the best song ever written. And he's got a fucking B-sides collection where basically half of those could apply to. So difficult designation to make. But right now, if you ask me, I would tell you Come On Up to the House is Tom Waits' absolute crowning fucking achievement. Not just because I think these songs go together emotionally, but because Come On Up to the House specifically feels like Tom is ushering in you and all of the characters that he's brought to life on this album into this next stage where they'll sort of seek and potentially find the sort of things that they're missing, or the things that all these people have sort of waited around for. Another sort of like fleeting theme on the album is just sort of the impermanence of everything that isn't human, and even the impermanence of human beings, but like just objects that are lost and places that become rendered meaningless by people not being or inhabiting them. And the idea of Take It With Me having sort of like imbuing that meaning onto objects, the sort of person who sounds like they're dying, tonally speaking, talking about all the things that he wants to take with him into the next phase of his existence, basically when he dies. And just all of the things that are imbued with all of these memories, all of this time, these experiences. It's a fucking sledgehammer of a song. But Come On Up to the House is tonally, like instrumentally, it's like the most invigorating thing here. Like the piano, the loud horns, and Tom's really like boisterous performance. And he's talking about like, get off down that cross, we could use the wood. I love lyrics like that just really paint you a sense of how like vivid all this imagery is, and just taking all these characters, taking you in this to this next thing, which could be death, it could be heaven, it could be whatever the next state of existence is, and it makes it feel natural and comforting, and like it makes it not feel scary anymore, which I'm a person who is deeply afraid of death all of the time, and something that genuinely kind of minimizes that and makes it seem okay is the feat of a poet who I could never hope to fully understand as Tom is. And that sort of ending, that tying the bow together, I just remember I've listened to this like every day this week, and there's a particularly hard day I had this week where things were really rough, and I still had to go to work, and I drove home, and this song came up on shuffle, and God, it obliterated me. I fucking, like, I'd never cried to this song before, just because it was inherently like, it has sadness, but it's like, it's still a sense of joy overwhelmingly. And it's just like, there's a part lyrically where he just sort of intones, which is maybe my favorite Tom Waits lyric, full stop, just because of how simple it is. It's, does life seem nasty, brutish, and short? Come on up to the house. And his performance, the instrumentation, everything about that, it just moved me to my core in a way that few songs ever do. It's just, this is just the best. This is just the best.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite song on this album is A Tie, between these last two. Like I can't
Yes, it
put one
is.
above the other personally. And they go together
No.
so well. I used to think that Come On Up to the House is about dying, is about, passing on to the next realm essentially. And it's certainly, that's a valid interpretation, definitely. And especially I think that's, reinforced by coming after Take It With Me, which very much seems to be a song about kind of, reflecting on all of the things that you've had, all of the love and all of the things that you've experienced, and just kind of like being grateful for all of that and not looking to the future. But now I think that Come On Up to the House is, or at least for me, it's less about like moving on to a new stage of life or a new stage of death or whatever, and just about like having someone put their arm around your shoulder. Like it's about having an invitation. It's about not being alone. It's someone
about being accepted.
It's about being accepted. Yeah. The idea of Come On Up to the House to me is not so much anymore like, don't be afraid of dying. But it kind of is that still, but like, it's also just come inside. Like you're standing out there in the cold and you don't need to be, because
Embrace community.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fucking profoundly moving. And as in terms of favorite lyrics, I'll go back to Take It With Me. I don't know if this is my favorite Waits lyric because he's just got, I would have to really like pour through all of them to think about this. But there's a line on here that this was the point that I broke last night listening to this, when he says, all that you've loved is all you own, which is like, that to me, like, I could write a 10,000 page thesis on like why that line fucks me up. Like everything, that's like some fucking meaning of life shit right there. Just in those words, all that you've loved is all you own.
I've literally written a fictional universe that sprawls more than 300,000 words, and none of them are as meaningful and potent as that.
And also like, I share your feelings about like, I think it's perfectly natural to have that sort of fear of death sort of thing. It can overwhelm sometimes, but like Tom is so good at like, he says something so like blunt and kind of just on the face of it sort of meaningless, and all of a sudden it can make you feel better about it, and as if your worries.
That's why I like the get off that cross, we could use the wood line. That's what that means to me. It's just like, get over your hangups and just fucking come on.
Yeah,
like that's.
And for me, like another part that really evokes that is in Take It With Me, when he says there ain't no good thing ever dies. Like,
yeah,
like that's fuck.
The only fucking thing in all of music that even remotely competes with this is Lump Street and Die Like a Rich Boy from Painting a Panic Attack. That's it. That's the only thing I can think of.
I mean, and also the two last songs on an album as well. So
yes.
Yeah. Shit, man.
I think Who Are You is my favorite Tom Waits song. But, and I mean, on the note of favorite Tom Waits lyrics, I think mine is probably, well, I did my time in the jail of your arms. Now Ophelia wants to know where she should turn. Which like makes me want to cut my face off and rip it into shreds. Like, oh my God, that hurts. Yeah, but Come On Up to the House is probably, it's hard to say because all the Tom Waits songs I've heard outside of like the first 5 albums, I think, are the ones I've heard at least. So many of them are like so scattershot, like Downtown Train and Old 55 are all way up there, shit like that. But Come On Up to the House is probably number 2 at the moment.
It's impossible to understate not just the power of the songwriting, but the power of his voice as well.
Yeah.
Here, I don't know. It's hard to say here more than before, but like just particularly on this record, and it's partly to do with the way that the vocals are positioned in the mix, the priority that they're given on this particular production. But he's loud on this record, and you hear the rasp of his voice, and you can kind of like feel the specific vibrations of his vocal cords when he kind of hangs on a word. you can hear that the years of his life in them. You can hear just the whole timbre and tonality of who he is in them. And it's really accentuated by the way the vocals are mic'd and positioned on this album. And it's so much of the effect of it, I think, is really in his voice and his delivery, which is an interesting thing actually to mention in terms of like, one of the things that makes Waits so effective is not just what he writes, but how he sings as a performer. That's an interesting point to mention on the note of the secondary release that we are to talk about. You
were talking about something that was so perfect, and I was just like, this is a perfect fucking transition. I have to use this point, is that the reason I wanted to pair this with this covers album was first because I wanted to mine some kind of meaning from this bizarre experience that I had, was that I think we've done a great job at accentuating why Tom Waits as an artist from a holistic perspective is a fucking peerless genius. Like, I don't care that I'm sucking his dick. I really don't. We, like, from every level on which music can be good and thoughtful, his is. And I feel like lots of singers and songwriters like him can kind of get diminished by being only notable for their words. Even though I would say that, yes, Tom Waits' biggest strength is his songwriting because he's the best fucking songwriter who's ever lived. But all of these other qualities are just as important in how they commingle and how they emphasize that lyricism, and how that lyricism in the right context can be rendered basically meaningless. That context in which
context.
and the wrong context is, of course, one Miss Scarlett Johansson. Now, look, I have nothing but love for Miss Scarlett Johansson as an actress. I've loved her in the movies like Sofia Coppola's fucking movie. I can't remember the name of it. I've loved her in the past. I think she is a very good actress. However, once I found out that she had an album that was nothing but covers of Tom Waits songs, I was just like, this is so bizarre. I have to hear it, especially because David Bowie appears on it multiple times. And like, fucking what? And
desperately trying to hit David Bowie down horrendous.
And this is at least an interesting record, because you would think like, oh, a covers album, like it's probably, you know, it's just somebody with a fucking guitar and they're just going to cover them. Is that in terms of covers albums that I've heard, this is one of the most radical in terms of how it transforms these songs. I would also say it's maybe the most misguided, because the thing that I kept coming back to is that Scarlett Johansson essentially transforms these into beach house songs, or at least would attempt to be beach house
radically transforming these songs into shit.
I wanted to cover this primarily because I think it emphasizes what is good about artists like Tom Waits for other reasons than their songwriting, because the one thing consistent between the covers that she's doing and Tom is the lyricism, obviously, but also just because from a production standpoint, this is like one of the worst things I've ever heard in my life. I can't fucking stand a moment of how this album sounds. There's like one song that like really pairs it back in No One Knows I'm Gone. That one is tolerable comparatively speaking, and like Fawn is just instrumental. So like, even though the organs on that are ugly as fuck and they're blaring, but like, what in the hell was anybody thinking about this? You, first of all, biggest problem, you can't fucking hear Scarlett. These instrumentals are Devin Townsend sized walls of sound that just like underneath, like her voice is just barely audibly eking out like just a tiny little bit, just because she's got a slightly deeper voice than a lot of singers, I think, like her. She doesn't sound great. She
cannot sing.
She can't. Okay, yeah,
I
she
mean,
can't sing.
It's no. I mean, just let's not beat around the bush here. She's just not very. She can't sing very
It
well.
is actually a pro of the album that we can't hear her all that well.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, to be honest.
But here's the thing: is that she has worked on one song, and that song is the Moon Song from the movie Her. And that's a movie where she's literally an artificially intelligent robot whose voice is audibly breaking as she sings that. And it's 1 minute and 30 seconds long. And it's a duet with Joaquin Phoenix. So naturally, this being an hour in length can be, or not an hour, it's 45 minutes, but it feels like an hour in length, feels somewhat taxing. Also, whenever David Bowie appears, it's like Peter Gabriel on that newest Arcade Fire album when you're like, that was him.
Oh, I recognize him
that
absolutely on that one song, the 5th song, I think it is, or like
Man in Street.
Sounds.
I love the original version of this song just because it's a great example of Tom's storytelling and how the main character sort of recontextualizes a part of their life after coming back to a place as a different person. And I love how this song, you just can't fucking hear the lyrics. You just can't hear them. They're in fucking audible. There's like sometimes where there's organs. There's sometimes where like on fucking Falling Down, this has a bass in it that like shook my fucking headphones. It sounds like it's audibly rumbling and like piercing the mix. Like, who engineered that? Like, this is just patently fucking embarrassingly incompetent.
Now, I have a complicated relationship with this. It's a bad album.
How?
I'm not. let me speak. It's a bad album.
Sorry.
Like, my complicated relationship has nothing to do with like, oh, part of me loves this or anything like that. It's to do with other things. So this album is produced, and a lot of the instrumentation is played by Dave Seatek, who I think is one of the best indie rock producers of the 2000s. A super, super awesome guy. He's a member of the band TV on the Radio, and he's produced, produced all their records. He's produced records for Liars. He produced all of the Years albums, actually.
Yeah, I was just about to say.
And he has, he's a really, really talented guy because he's a great way of like
Antidotes by Foles.
Yeah. He's just got his fingerprints all over it, all sorts of great stuff. And it pains me to be having to kind of reveal this, because this is like the worst possible display of his strengths you could possibly come across. Because, well, the thing about it is that the things he's good at making sound good are not the things that Scarlett is wanting this record to sound like.
No, not at all.
He's good with like really muscular, rhythm-focused music. He's good when there's a strong bass and drum presence, when there's a strong presence of electronics.
Wolf Like Me, All You Need to Know.
Yeah. And I was going to bring up that album that song is on, Return to Cookie Mountain by TV on the Radio, because that album is an interesting case, because that is a really distorted and cloudy record that has a lot of compression and sort of fuzz in it. And that production style is not going to work for everyone, but I think that it's tremendously effective. And then on a record like Dear Science, which is the 2008 TV on the Radio record, which is the same year this came out, all of that is kind of the noise is kind of pared back, and that's an incredibly slick and really, really fucking catchy record. And so few of the strengths of Seatek are put to good use here. I can only assume that this was a real rush job. And the reason why I labor on Seatek so much is it's not just that he produced this record. He plays a lot of the instruments on this record. He helped realize a lot of the vision of this record. And also other members of TV on the Radio are on this record as well. The band's bassist, Jaleel Bunton, plays on this record. The band's vocalist, Tunde Adebimpe, is on the song for Joe, which incidentally is also the only original on the album. And a song that has some musical ideas I like. I will say that. It is
it's certainly one of the better ones.
Also, Nick Zinner of the Years plays guitar on almost every song on this record as well. So there you go. The thing that really complicates this is that I am actually familiar with one of the songs on this record, and have been ever since this album came out. Before I'd even listened to Tom Waits. In fact, I didn't know until you brought this album up a few months ago, when I saw that it was on this album that it was even a Tom Waits cover, because it's a cover of a song that isn't on a studio album of Tom's.
Yeah.
And this is the song Falling Down, which was a single for this record, I'm pretty sure. And there was the time when this came out, 2008, around that time, in the period from like 2006 to like 2011, was a period where like my dad would always constantly have like alternative music TV channels on TV all the time. And I would consume whatever they were showing. It's how I got into Animal Collective and Passion Pit and all these awesome late 2000s bands. And one of the songs that I remember hearing and was Scarlett Johansson's Falling Down. And I really liked that song as a kid. There was just something about the sound of it that I really, really loved. I especially liked the twinkling glockenspiel sound and the huge guitar noise effects in the back half of the song. It sounds like noise to me now, but I liked it as a kid. Yeah,
I was going to say.
I did like it as a kid. This was one of the very first MP3 player I had like, I don't know, 500 megabytes of storage. So I could only fit like 50 songs on it or something. And this was one of them. And I just, for some reason, really listened to it a lot. I don't know why I liked it now. It sounds so, it's one of the songs I think where Scarlett's vocal presence is at its most just completely monotonous and just utterly unpresent at all. And also she just kind of has a way of taking great lyrics of Tom's and just kind of like delivering them so like portentously that they feel so trite, and just they start to really like feel like bad lyrics because she's just putting so much just like momentous kind of importance on them in a way that just rings as so false and so just utterly wrong.
Worst example of that is, I think, where all of the record's weaknesses come to a single meeting point, which is the cover of I Don't Want to Grow Up.
Oh, the worst thing here. Let's
my
not fucking
God.
debate around the bush. If this is if you don't think this is the worst thing here, I want to know what's worse than this, because it's fucking horrifically bad.
Like, I don't know. I mean, it might not be worse, but the Who Are You cover gets under my skin.
Oh, I can understand why. Yeah, that's a bad one.
Like, those are two songs that really rely on the intonation of the voice. So naturally, the monotone vocals do not help. But like the fact that this sounds like it's produced like it's on a Sufjan Stevens Christmas album. If it was like if it sounded like shit. Like the tempo of the song is changed, and it's again the lyricism that's initially like the dissonance between the kind of youthful lyrics and the old gruff delivery is just fucking gone, and it becomes this gormless, textureless fucking plastic brick of a song. It's like listening to a cube of ice. Like it's fucking. It's just so distinctly non-musical, and I completely co-signed the fucking Who Are You cover, which is just like, it's the final song on here, and it's like, God, I know this is a covers album, but why did you structure your album like this? Why nothing about this is even remotely thoughtful in terms of what songs come after the other? It's just
It's fucking not. They just fucking shuffle.
What's just as an aside. CD. This album has a specific credit for sequencing to a man named Ivo Watts Russell, who was the co-founder of the record label 4AD, and is incidentally the person that the Cocteau Twins song Ivo is named after. Because he produced their first album, Garlands. I don't have a point with this. I just found that it was an interesting rabbit hole.
She is definitely trying to evoke Cocteau Twins with the production of this album. Like it sounds like someone who cannot afford to make an album that sounds like Cocteau Twins, like that sounds like Heaven or Las Vegas, and simply does not have the money and also can't fucking sing.
I just want to, as a last note, I just want to shout out my favorite credit on any record ever is actually on this record. A man named Ryan Sawyer on Town with No Cheer is credited with playing the dog bowl.
The Town with No Cheer cover is like an endless dirge. This song feels like a fucking 25-minute long prog song. You're just waiting for this thing to fucking end.
One thing I'll say, the best song here, I think, is the opening track, which is a cover of the instrumental that closes off of Alice. And the reason this is the best song here, one is because it has the most like presence and impact of anything on here, but also because it's the only one that doesn't feature Scarlett in any form.
The only song on here that like I don't like any, like I think this is a fucking disaster and ill-conceived on basically all levels. I really, really dislike it. The thing that I think is the closest to enjoyable is probably Green Grass, because it's like the most minimal thing here. Like it's still something that doesn't sound good and isn't being sung well, but it is a simple song that is less burdened by the production, and it's just kind of like it makes me long for the oppressive production of Real Gone, which is an instance where something like the suffocation and the bricked out mixes help, but just like and listening to this as a single experience, God, it's like it is a like I literally listened to a Lightning Bolt album this week that like hurt to listen to less than this did. Like this is just so bricked. It's
okay. So there are two comparisons that I've come up with. One of them is a hypothetical, and one of them happened.
Oh no!
In 2020, Glenn Danzig, formerly and also kind of currently of the Misfits, made an Elvis covers album.
Yeah.
I don't think I need to say anything else. But I also had the thought, just because MCU connections, this is like if like Jeremy Renner made a Simon and Garfunkel covers album. Like it's that level of talent. And it's just
God.
like,
I want to just say I appreciate the Danzig discography for having album titles such as Lucifuge, How the Gods Kill, Black Acid Evil, Satan's Child, Circle of Snakes, Death Red Sabbath, and then Danzig sings Elvis. Amazing.
It's his second cover. His first features a cover of Black Sabbath's NIB, which is like awful on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. It's like Lovecraftianly awful.
It's comedy gold. It's so funny.
It's comedy gold, but I can't laugh. My body refuses.
Okay, let's circle back to Tom Waits to close up, because I think that a nice way to finish this video up on a high before we do our ratings and all that is I found an interview with Tom around the time that this record came out. I was reading through this interview, and there's so many choice quotes in this interview. And so at the risk of completely embarrassing myself, I think I'm going to read some of these quotes in what I can hopefully approximate as somewhat of a Tom Waits impression, so that you can enjoy hopefully some cheer that will put a smile on your face after this depressing discussion in multiple different ways. And okay, so this in this interview, he was asked it was basically a track by track interview almost, where he was asked about all the different songs on the record. And so I will read you some of my favorites here. There's a lot here, so I'll just try and pick some out. But anyway, this is the interviewer says, "Are you really, as the opening track declares, big in Japan? How do you know this? Have you ever been there? I see myself in the harbor, ripping up the electrical towers, picking up cars, going in like Godzilla and leveling Tokyo. There are people that are big in Japan and are big nowhere else. It's like going to Mars. It's also kind of a junkyard for entertainment. You can go over there and find people you haven't heard of in 20 years that have moved over there, and they're like gods. And then there are all those people that don't do any commercials, have this classy image. And over there, they're hawking cigarettes, underwear, sushi, whiskey, sunglasses, used cars, beach blankets. I was in Mexico in a hotel, and I only had this little tape recorder. I turned it on and I started screaming and banging on this chest of drawers really hard till it was kindling, trying to make a full sound like a band. And I saved that. That was years ago. I had it on a cassette and I used to listen to it and laugh. It sounded like some guy alone in a room, which it was, trying his hardest to sound like a big loud band. So that's what you hear at the very start of the record.
Which it was.
On the computer, you have to call them something. So I have.
Who plays the rooster on Chocolate Jesus? That's a real rooster. Yeah, but he was crowing right on cue. He was crowing on cue. You know, one thing about animals, when you record outside, they'll pretty much wait until you're finished with your phrase. Because no one wants to talk while you're talking, especially a rooster.
I love this weird, unknowable man.
Is this rooster left over from when the studio was a chicken ranch? It still is a chicken ranch. So if you go outside, which we did on that song, we just set up in the driveway. You use directional microphones. They look like rifles, and they use them for field recordings. The engineer found them at a flea market. So if you set up right outside with the dogs and the chickens, the airplanes and the trucks, it's amazing how your surroundings will collaborate with you. Let's do our favorite tracks and ratings for Mule Variations first. Jake, why don't you go?
Well, you may have clued in. I like this album, so this is pretty hard. We are officially only one album away from having covered all 10 of my favorite records of all time. Death Consciousness is the only one left. Now that this is off the list. But 3 favorite tracks, I'm doing the tie between Come On Up to the House and Take It With Me because it's my record club. Fuck you. And I will also say Hold On and Georgia Lee. Least favorite track? Hell no. Not existing. And I give the album the hard 10. And as for Miss Johannson, my 3 least favorite songs are Town with No Cheer, I Don't Want to Grow Up, and Anywhere I Lay My Head. That song is also another one that's just I love dearly, that's just fucking neutered by everything here, and I hate it. Favorite song, who cares? Fucking 1.5 out of 10.
All right. Morgan, your favorite tracks and ratings?
I will say, Come On Up to the House, Georgia Lee. It's very difficult, but I think I'm actually gonna go with Black Market Baby. I think least favorite, I will say Filipino Box Spring Hog, just because it's like wildly entertaining, but I don't connect with it emotionally in any other way than just going like
next
and there's something about every other song on here that I connect with in some way. So I will give this a 9.5 for now, subject to change. For the Johannson album, like I didn't prepare anything. Fuck off, Scarlett. 3 out of 10.
All right. For Tom Waits, all I'm going to do is just list the 10s, the 10 out of 10 songs, keeping in mind that I have very stringent criteria, I guess. I mean, not that it's written out or anything, but just anyway, the perfect songs on this record are Big in Japan, Hold On, Georgia Lee, What's He Building is a 10, yeah, chuck that on there. Take It With Me and Come On Up to the House. My least favorite is probably Black Market Baby, actually. It's good, though. I don't mind it. And I'm going to give this an 8.5 myself. As for Miss Johannson, yeah, that opening instrumental is pretty good, I think. I honestly, I don't like this album. It's a bad record, but I don't, feel an overwhelming venom towards it. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10, which I know you're probably thinking that's fucking way too high, but whatever. It's a bad album.
No,
Still.
I mean, I specifically hate it. I didn't expect everybody to fucking.
I mean,
shit
it's mostly
themselves.
just like I don't care.
Yeah.
Just
So
I don't
anyway, overall,
Get out there.
Scarlett Johansson's Anywhere I Lay My Head gets an average of 2.8 out of 10. And Tom Waits' Mule Variations gets an average of 9.3 out of 10 from the Jams and Tea podcast. Let us know at home what you think of this Tom Waits album, the Scarlett Johansson one, if you've heard it too. You don't have to. We want to hear from you in the comments below. We want to hear your
I wouldn't
takes.
advise it.
Where does Tom's Mule Variations rank in your Tom Waits ranking, if you have one, or maybe it's one of the few you've heard? Either way, let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your takes and opinions, and it also helps us with getting engagement and helping our videos to get seen by more people. Another thing that helps with that as well is likes as well. So if you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving it a like. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, you can head on over to the YouTube page by following the link in the description and give us a like or a comment via that method. If you enjoy what we do, if you enjoyed this episode and you want more, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. That helps us probably in the biggest way possible too. And if you want to support us even more than that, and you want to really show your affection, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can become a part of the Jams and Tea family, a member of this channel, get your name featured on every video on this channel, plus get emojis of our faces to use in the comments. Plus, maybe most meaningfully, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about and check out, then your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Jack Daniels. Make it count.